Good morning, friends. Grab a cup of coffee. I want to talk about the deep state this morning because I think I might have actually been a part of it and I had no idea what I was doing. So, this is in the news. The Supreme Court clears the way for Trump to pursue mass federal layoffs. As you know, at the beginning of the year with Doge and Elon Musk, the administration was pushing for a reduction in the federal workforce, and so they got rid of a bunch of jobs and agencies like USAID. And obviously, people are not happy about that. But apparently, on Tuesday, so yesterday, the Supreme Court cleared the way for the administration to pursue mass layoffs and downsize agencies. And this would reduce staff at agriculture, commerce, health and human services, state, treasury, veterans affairs, and others. Obviously, federal bureaucrats are not happy because they're about to lose their jobs. And unlike private sector workers, once you're in the federal government, the chances of losing your job are pretty much nil. So these people have no concept of what it's like to live in the real world, to put it bluntly, and how people do lose jobs for myriad reasons. And just as lots of tech companies right now are downsizing, the federal government is too. But I want to focus on the deep state aspect of this because this is a conversation that has been happening for some time, and it's seen as a conspiracy. It's seen as a right-wing crazy conspiracy. But I was a government contractor for several years, worked inside of agencies implementing, particularly in DoD. I worked in DoD implementing different programs, and I saw things that at the time I didn't really understand or know because I was only in my mid-20s. I was just eager to build my career. And now that I'm kind of on the other side of the political ideologies and leftist ideology, now that I have a clearer mind, and now that obviously I'm not in DC and I'm not working in this world, I have a fresh perspective on what I witnessed and observed and experienced. So I wanted to share some of that with you because I do think this is important, and the resistance we're seeing start to build up against downsizing of the federal workforce and how federal workers are responding to it is a real cause for concern, and something, if you're not in DC and you're not aware of how this world works and you just see it on the news or hear about it through videos like this, you don't quite understand the culture and the society that exists within DC and how the group of people that run the government fundamentally do believe they are separate and above you. And I think this is going to be a big fracture point for us as a society as stuff like this continues to move through the courts and as resistance to Trump continues to build. So I wanted to first go to Wikipedia to talk about what the deep state conspiracy theory is. I'm not focusing on like the FBI, CIA, secret police deep state. I'm more interested in this professor's discussion of it. He talks about the American deep state, which is really the American bureaucracy. It includes federal agencies responsible for regulation, welfare, crime, prevention, defense, and the employees who operate them fundamentally. So they differ. Okay. So anyways, it's bureaucrats. So the bureaucracy is the deep state. They're individuals who exist outside of the three branches of government, so outside of the executive branch headed by the president, the judicial, which is headed by the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch, which is obviously represented by Congress. So these agencies, so all your alphabet soup government agencies, so if you remember your history from FDR and the New Deal, you have the Public Works Administration, the Social Security Administration, anything that's an administration or an agency tasked with administering a program. Typically, these are welfare programs. Within the EPA, they're the Environmental Protection Agency. They're probably regulatory programs. Within USAID, they were humanitarian programs, which I have thoughts about that as well. Within DoD, for me, I worked on a training and equipping program. So we receive funds from Congress to buy equipment to train people, and then we subcontracted out to provide the actual training itself. And I focused on a program that dealt with counter-nuclear smuggling in the Middle East. So essentially, how to react if the unlikely scenario that a dirty bomb might go off or some sort of fissile material might be moved outside of a secure facility, how do first responders, how do your local civil defense, your police, your firefighters, how do you work together to contain that thing and prevent it from becoming a catastrophe? If all it takes is some substance to go into the water supply, then all of a sudden an entire village or city is affected. So you can't just respond to a nuclear or radiological incident with your standard protocols. So that's kind of the stuff I did. And so you needed, special equipment for that. So lead line suits and things like that. So that's what my team did. We helped with stuff like that. But bureaucrats and the people who staff these agencies, they exist outside of the three branches of government, but they're supposed to be civil servants. That's what they're called, civil servants, that implement these programs. And I don't think what people realize is after Trump got elected the first time, the bureaucracy became highly politicized. And I, unfortunately, don't have a lot of experience in government pre-Trump. I started my first official government contracting job on the client site in 2016. So I was there for the last, hurrah of the Obama administration. And then obviously everything switched over to the first Trump administration. I did notice a palpable difference, though. I did, as soon as, every office has, government agency has pictures of their leadership. So you'll have the president, I think the vice president, and then whoever the secretary is. So if you go into Health and Human Services, you'd have portraits up of Obama, J.D. Vance, and then RFK, right? And so I remember you'd have to go through security, and I would see Trump's picture every day, and there was just a palpable anger and hate towards it, and just the culture within DC kind of shifted after Trump, which is just it's interesting because people, you work in government because you're supposed to be putting your politics aside. Again, civil servants aren't working for Congress necessarily, okay? These aren't people who are working for lobbyists. These aren't people who are working for think tanks. They might go back and forth, right? They might work in a government agency and then go work for a think tank. So there is that pipeline. But typically the career civil servants, the ones who are there for several decades, who are just doing their job, they're paper pushers. And a lot of them take pride in what they do, although I don't know that they know what they do, to be totally honest. I work with some people who they just beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop all day, and they would get in their cars at 4 p.m. and go home, and they repeated that for several decades, and they called that a life. I don't know. Anyways, I want to talk about why I think the politicization of the bureaucracy is a problem, and how this has created a deep state that is creating a fracture point within American politics. So I'm going to turn to The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. She was a German political scientist, and she wrote in the 50s and 60s and 70s about the Nazi atrocities. And this book is about, she looks at the Nazis and then the Soviet Union, obviously. It's fascinating. It's kind of 3 books in one. It's quite a dense read. And it can be hard. It's a little, the writing's a little dense. But if you're concerned about where the country is going, if you're concerned about the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, you need to read this book. This is an essential read. It kind of goes through the history of kind of how Nazism emerged and the consequences of it. And I think we think things because we get a very watered down view of history, and we don't actually understand the context through which different political movements emerge. And Nazism didn't emerge out of a vacuum. There was a good century prior to it where things just built up, and then the powder keg exploded. So I highly recommend getting this. It's a really good book. Anyways, she talks about the bureaucracy, and she talks about government by bureaucracy is government by decree. And this means that power, which in constitutional government only enforces the law, becomes the direct source of all legislation. I think this is important because this is basically where we are right now. Congress doesn't really do its job, and we just saw this with the One Big Beautiful Bill, right? They've created, instead of bringing every piece of legislation to the floor, debating it, having, this side says this side says this. Everything is packed into one bill. So you can't say no because, a lot of these people, legislators, they build their careers by successfully passing legislation. So if you have to pass a piece of legislation within an omnibus bill, so a bill that just packages a bunch of stuff together, and that's the only way you can essentially get receipts to take back to your constituents to get reelected for another term, that's what you're going to do. And it's not just your constituents. You need receipts to take to your lobbyist friends and the folks funding your next campaign. And so we've created Congress has abdicated its responsibility. It doesn't do anything anymore. So in part, I think we should be focusing our anger on Congress and the legislative process, both at the local, state, and the federal level. The people who have been elected to represent us are not doing their jobs. And so what has happened is over time, the federal government has grown in scope because it's the only way to get things done. So when you see Trump signing executive orders, that is not him usurping power from the people. That is the evidence of decades of degradation of the legislative process. If Congress was doing its job, Trump wouldn't need to sign executive orders. Biden wouldn't have had to have done it. Obama wouldn't have had to have done it. It's not a unique Trump phenomenon. It's over several decades. Congressmen would rather go play golf, go to their special clubs, play the game of politics than actually legislate. Like they don't have skin in the game. They're not legislating. They're not doing their jobs. And so what has happened is you have government by bureaucracy, which is government by decree. And this means that powers in constitutional government only enforces the law, becomes the direct source of all legislation. And so this is what DOJ was kind of going after. It was going after all of these regulations that have been de facto laws, essentially. So it's not so much that Congress is saying you need to do something. It's the EPA is saying you need to do this. Health and Human Services is saying you need to do this. The USDA is saying you need to do this. And I think a really great example is the USDA and how it regulates beef manufacturing and milk and stuff like that. An interesting thing in Pennsylvania this past election was the Amish. The Amish historically have not participated in American politics. They think whoever is elected it's the will of God, and they're not going to interfere with that. They'll just let it be. But this election, the Amish got involved, and of course they voted for Trump, and not for the reasons you're thinking. The Amish got involved because the USDA over the past couple years has been regulating the hell out of them. You have raw milk producers in Lancaster County and in different counties in Pennsylvania who have been just regulating the Amish to death. And there was an incident, there was a big farm, I forget the dates, but there was a farm in Amish country that was producing raw milk, and somehow the milk moved across state lines. The Amish aren't selling the milk in stores. There's no interstate commerce, but for whatever reason, someone purchased the milk and then took it back with them into California, and they got sick. And so the commerce got involved because it was interstate commerce and all this stuff, and they were trying to shut them down. And I think this is a really, really good example of, you have there's laws in place to keep people healthy, right? There's laws in place with, food safety and all of that stuff. But the implementation of those laws comes down to individual bureaucrats and bureaucrats within different agencies. And sometimes there's competition, right? So sometimes USDA and Department of Commerce might show up at the same space and have conflict. I experienced this when I worked for Department of Defense. Department of Defense and State Department don't like each other. The type of people who work there are very different types of people. It's really hard to get a lot of collaboration between State Department and Department of Defense. That's why you see a lot of duplication across departments. There was a team that did exactly what my team did, but for State Department. It should be a whole government-wide thing. Like, yes, we're going to provide X, Y, and Z to this country so that if there's a radiological incident, they can respond. this is what this agency is going to do, this is what this agency is going to do, like dole out the responsibilities. That's not how it works. There's so much competition between the different government agencies, and then the offices within those agencies, and then the programs within those offices, that there's duplication across government. And so you have bureaucrats who have created these little fiefdoms for themselves. They derive value not just from their ability to implement the regulations that they've been entrusted with, but to continue spending money and to continue growing the amount of money that they spend from year to year in order to justify asking Congress for even more money. So the success of a government bureaucrat is growing their budget, even if they're not using it appropriately. Whereas if you look at the private sector and a CEO, their objective is to grow profitability, but they can do that through a variety of ways. You can do that through a merger and an acquisition. You can do that through mass layoffs and job cuts. You can do that through outsourcing. Like, there's all different types of levers that a CEO has at their disposal to enhance profitability, to pass on to shareholders. That's not the case within the government. The government works the exact opposite. They want to grow their budgets. And if you don't grow your budget, it's a sign of failure. And it could stymie your career. You might not get the promotion you're looking for if you're fiscally responsible. So there's all these perverse incentives. But what I'm getting at here is, because Congress isn't really legislating, they're appropriating, so they're taking your tax dollars and they're doling them out to these different government agencies and then funding those agencies. They've essentially empowered the people within these agencies to enforce the laws. So it honestly depends on who you're working with, what day of the week it is, and what's going on in their personal life. If things are all great and hunky-dory, you'll have an easy time. There won't be any problems. If they're going through a divorce, or their kids are making them mad, or there's inter-office politics and conflict with their boss, well, maybe they're going to be a little bit harder on you. And so a lot of times the bureaucratic process is very personality dependent. And this is why when people are applying for government grants and stuff, you really need to have a relationship with the people who are issuing the grant, because then you'll have a better sense of whether or not you'll actually get it. You could have the best idea in the world and go for a small business grant or a National Science Foundation grant, and you might not get it just because you're working with cranky pants over here who just doesn't want to award it to you, or who is too fastidious in the way that they read the requirements, and they want to make sure they cross every T and dot every I. And this is where the fraud, waste, and abuse comes in. It's you've created a system with perverse incentives that incentivizes government bureaucrats to spend more money than they need to. You've empowered them to work outside of the three branches of government, so to legislate by decree, as Hannah Arendt talks about here. But then you've had to introduce this element of developing personal relationships with these people who are in de facto power, because that's the only way things get done. That's literally the only way things get done. And to give you an anecdotal experience, I was working on a USAID contract. This was my first paid job in 2015. So I'd been in DC for 8 months at this point. I was basically an intern. So this was my first paid job. I was paid $16 an hour to talk to folks living in Raqqa, Syria, which is where ISIS was headquartered. So I was basically talking to people and members of ISIS using WhatsApp and Skype and all sorts of things, doing open source intelligence analysis of Facebook and Twitter and social media to see what was happening on the ground in Syria. This was paid for by USAID. I was working, this is where the USAID stuff is a little weird in my opinion. I was working at a strategy shop that was founded by an Australian counterinsurgency expert. So I don't know what a humanitarian organization wanted to do with paying someone like me to do intelligence reporting at a small company in an office in Virginia that was founded by a guy who's a counterinsurgency expert. The math doesn't math there. So when you have folks who are coming up and talking about what USAID was actually doing, it's connecting light bulb in my head, connecting some dots, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, I was 23 at the time. I was doing this stuff. Had no idea I was part of it. Anyways, I digress. But I was working in this agency, and I was hired by this company because their contract was up for renewal, and they were anticipating they would get a renewal. Contracts go up for bid depending on the period of performance on the contract. It could be annually. It could be like every couple of years. So you might have a contract that's for year one, and then if it's successful, that they'll extend it. They'll extend the period of performance for another year and another year and another year. But you have to basically go work with the contract shop that you are being funded by, at whatever agency you're being funded by, and prove that like you're providing value, and they'll reaward your contract. And oftentimes this is what happens. And again, this is why I say there's fraud, waste, and abuse, because it's much easier. It's like the easy button from Staples. It's much easier to just reaward contracts to people you've been working with for years than bring an entirely new group of people in. So it's really hard for new folks to come in and compete with incumbents, to be totally honest. So this is why you're seeing a lot of big contractors and big folks that constantly win the same awards over and over. Anyways, so I was working with a USAID funded company in Virginia. I was hired because they anticipated that they would win their recompete. This assumption was predicated on the relationships that folks on this team that I was working for had with the folks at USAID. So this was a relationship-based arrangement that was in place. I want to say in April of 2015, there was a personnel change within USAID. So suddenly the people that my people had been working with were no longer there. It was a new team of people within USAID, and that new people did not like my people. So unsurprisingly, by the end of May, early June, we were told, okay, you're not getting the award again. We awarded it to a different contractor. And so my company lost, and because I was, the low woman on the totem pole being paid $16 an hour on the assumption of a recompete, I was sent to the curb. Like it was a brutal experience. I was sent to the curb, given nothing. There's no pink slips and severance in these types of roles. It just ended up being a scarlet letter on my resume, and I honestly never recovered from it because of that. But that's just to give you an example of how all of these relationships and why personal relationships matter. Like how things are funded, how laws or regulations are implemented are a result of the personalities within the government. And this is why I think the deep state is really important. So this is a Reddit thread I came across. I was trying to look for something to show you to give you an example of what this means. So this is a Reddit thread where federal employees are coming together, committing to dismantling, or not dismantling, they're afraid that Trump is trying to dismantle the institutions that run this country, and that they're going to push back and work together. We're not going to back down. And so you can just read through here. So please know there's management resisting from within, whatever they can do to protect employees. They all talk about how everyone's hardworking, blah, blah, blah. Like you can read stuff like this if you want. But see, you are on the front line against fascism. I stand by my oath. I solemnly swear to defend my country. That talking about all this. Anyways, you can go through and read stuff like this. I would, if you don't understand the deep state, I would strongly recommend doing stuff like that. I just remembered. I need to make sure I don't get interrupted. Okay. Definitely read stuff like this because it'll give you an insight into what's happening. So I can share my experience and my observation from this. So folks within the government are highly educated. A lot of them, not all, a lot of them are like me, who came from out of state, rural areas, and then moved into DC to try to, do good for the world. A lot of them are former college students. There's universities in DC, Georgetown and American are probably the two bigger ones. And those are often pipelines for people who come out of, college, and then they go work in these and these different government agencies. There was a girl from my high school, a couple of years older than me. She went to George Washington University. Oh, that's the other big one. GW, Georgetown, and American. She went to GW and then ended up working with USAID. So it ends up being, if you want to work for the government, you go to one of these three schools, and then you end up getting in. A lot of these folks, they grew up in the area. DC is a very wealthy area, so if your parents, worked in a government agency, it's no different, honestly, than like union families in Detroit. If your dad was, a union man working at, a GM, Ford, whatever, assembly line, like you kind of got ushered into that. That was the family business. It's the same thing for bureaucrats, which is why it's hard for outsiders to break in. You have entrenched, not families per se, but like you have entrenched groups of people within in the suburbs, so Northern Virginia and in Maryland, and they can have their kids come in and just work and do the jobs. And again, anecdotal experience, the government contract I was working on with DOD, I was working for a private company, so even though I sat alongside and worked directly with the federal government, I wasn't technically on the government payroll, so I do want to make that distinction very clear. My paycheck, however, was funded by the contract from the government, so it was kind of indirect. Anyways, the company I worked with, the guy who was the program manager for the contract I was on, he hired two of his daughters to work on the contract with us, and they were kind of doing like back office administrative stuff. The guy who ran my program itself, his wife had been hired to work on a different program. So there's a lot of nepotism, but not in like a Hunter Biden, Joe Biden relationship kind of way, or even like an Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump kind of way. It's not that kind of nepotism. It's more like, well, my dad works here, therefore I'm going to get a job here, and then he's going to, I'll meet his friends and then get a job that way. So you have a lot of folks who are able to like get into the government like that. So you have an area that is completely insulated and divorced from the rest of the country, right? You have folks in DC who are doing jobs and they've learned how to do the jobs of bureaucrat, but they don't necessarily have the experience of the thing that they're regulating. So USDA is a great example. You could take a kid who studies at Georgetown or GW or whatever. So maybe they went to a private school, right? These are private schools, and so maybe they went to a private high school. So they come from like a socioeconomically elevated. If you think of socioeconomics as a totem pole, they're up top, right? So you can have someone who is up top. And they're doing great. They go to Georgetown, GW, whatever, and then they get a job working at USAID, and they climb the ranks, and eventually they're a program manager or whatever, and they're in charge for regulating, farmers like the Amish who sell raw milk in Pennsylvania, right? These people have never been on a farm. They have probably never picked up a shovel in their life. They have nothing on their hands. They have no bruises, no calluses. Like they've probably never done any hard work at all in their lives. And if they did any sort of work, it was probably a performative missions trip or volunteer trip overseas where they, it was good for the photo op, good for the resume. They didn't actually do anything, right? And so DC is filled with these people. It's filled with these people who are there, they're entrenched, they've been there, families may have been there for a decade or two. They've gone to elite universities, so they have, that mark on their resume. And of course, you have folks from like Harvard and Stanford and that coming in too. So you have a lot of elitism within the college educated crowd, and they have no experience actually doing the thing they were supposed to be doing. So I was interesting in the jobs I did because the first one, the USAID one, I actually did live in the Middle East, and I lived in Jordan and studied Arabic there. So I had some understanding of the culture, but even then, like looking back, how like white savior complex, right? Like I grew up in an evangelical Christian family in upstate New York. Yeah, I lived in the Middle East. Yeah, I studied the culture. Yeah, I learned the language, but even then I'm not an expert, right? I'm like, who am I? Who am I to go in and try to interpret what different groups and especially, the Islamic State, what different groups are doing? Looking back, it was just it gives me cringe. Like, I can't believe I did that kind of work. But anyways, there's people like me. There are people like me who didn't live in the Middle East, who learned Arabic on their own, and they're the ones responsible for translating, calls that were coming into the Syrian civil war hotline. And this was a scandal. When I was living there was someone who mistranslated a word. So that the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing body in the West Bank, is in Arabic is Sulta al-Falastiniya, and the word for salad in Arabic is salata. So if you're a non-native speaker, like, Arabic is really, really difficult to learn, and that's part of the reason. You have just different letters and sounds and vowels, and so salata and salata, and I'm probably even pronouncing it wrong, but the words are so close together, you could easily confuse the two, and that happened where someone was like on call at some State Department hotline, and they mistranslated Palestinian Authority for Palestinian salad. So that just gives you, an idea. Like, the people who are responsible for administering all of these agencies aren't actually the experts they profess themselves to be. But that's where the problem lies, is people working in the bureaucracy in DC, because of their credentials and their experience, they see themselves as holier than thou. And a lot of these people, because of how the job market works in DC, they have advanced degrees. So it's not just, me, random, chick from upstate New York with a degree in political science going to Washington and DC to work. No, you have people with, JDs and master's degrees, and because there's so much equity that they've put in their education, and they see education as the ultimate credential, because that's what effectively it is. It's a credential that gives them social value, that they expect a certain level of privilege within society and culture, right? It's the same. It's no different than a celebrity, right? If a celebrity has so many, followers and audience, right? Like Taylor Swift. Okay, look at Taylor Swift. Like, Taylor Swift's, a lovely human being, but Taylor Swift has a certain expectation of life, given where she's at in her career and her following and all that kind of stuff. Like, she doesn't really get, it doesn't really get into her head. But there are celebrities where, like, once they make it, like, they change, they start expecting certain things, bottle service and whatever. So there's people like that, and the same equivalent is true in Washington, D.C. with members of the bureaucracy. They're not political elites. They're not elected. They're not appointed, right, by whoever is elected. But they have power, and because they are surrounded by other people who think like them, it's a giant echo chamber. I don't know what the stats are on the political affiliation within the bureaucracy. I know the Hatch Act precludes people from overtly participating in politics, so you can't give to, like, political action committees when you're a member, an employee of the federal government. Like, that's no. I don't know what that means, though, for protests. I'm not clear about that, if you can protest or not. But there was a piece, Uri Berliner was a 20-plus year veteran of NPR, and he wrote a piece in the Free Press, I believe last year, and he talked about the ideological conformity within NPR's editorial staff, and he found that there wasn't a single registered Republican in their ranks. And that's not to say that conservative-leaning folks don't exist, and NPR is obviously very left-leaning, so it's not surprising. But I think NPR is also a microcosm for the whole DC apparatus, especially people who live in DC proper. Is very, very blue, and you would be hard-pressed to find Trump supporters. A lot of them live out in rural Virginia, places that clearly more align with their values. And so I assume within DOD, because I know there were some folks I worked with who were like explicitly like MAGA, pro-Trump. I don't know about the other agencies. I don't know within USAID, is it more like NPR? Is it like 90 to 100% all Democrats who work there? Probably, because there's a bias, right? There's a bias towards the type of work you do. And I'm not saying that all humanitarians are Democrats, But I think a lot of Democrats lean towards social justice and humanitarian efforts. So there's a correlation there that I think could suggest the vast majority of those people probably are. And a lot of the people, again, like I was in my 20s, so that's kind of the perspective I have to share. Folks at that level, the paper pushing bureaucratic level, were also 20s and 30s, so they were young. So they probably were more liberal. And so these people think, they're high on their own supply. There's a lot of egoism. They have, maybe they've been bolstered by nepotism or going to an elite school. They think they're holier than thou. They think they're better than you. And I say this as someone who thought this, right? I was part of this. I was in this deep. And I thought for a period of time I was better than everyone else. I was like, I'm great. I'm going to go do my thing in DC and become this great, wonderful person. And then, obviously got kicked in the rear with reality and realized like that's not how the world works. And it's not really what you should aspire to. You shouldn't be aspiring to your own fulfillment of yourself, your own greatness. It's just so vapid. But anyways, you have people like this within DC who are probably more liberal leaning, so they're going to be anti-Trump. And so because they can't express, people on federal payrolls can't express themselves directly. They can vote, but like they can't necessarily express themselves away like you and I can. They have to find alternative means to quote unquote resist. And so one of the ways they're doing this, and they talk about it here, please know there's management resisting from within. So what they're doing within these government agencies is they're using their power, the power entrusted in enforcing and implementing these regulations. They're using this as a means of resistance. And so if they think, and again, I don't know if this is happening, this is just like an example I'm throwing out there, but if you have a bunch of people, a bunch of liberals working in USAID, and they're pissed off because their jobs are about to be cut, or they hate Trump or whatever, they're going to make it really hard for the farmers they're regulating because they're going to assume, probably right, that a lot of the farmers are more conservative, right? And so you're going to you see stuff like this. Or what we saw with USAID, like we saw clear examples of leftist programs being implemented. So they're implementing things that align with their values, not my values, not your values, their values. So they're implementing things. Or if things don't go to plan, they're making it difficult to get stuff done. And so what does this look like? I was watching a Tim Pool episode, and he was kind of talking about this, where federal workers were talking about, taking a lot of coffee breaks, and, organizers were encouraging people to, do their work slowly and all this kind of stuff. Like, I took a lot of coffee breaks when I worked for the government, and it wasn't because I was resisting. I was just bored out of my goddamn mind. But this is what they're talking about. It's becoming a human impediment to getting stuff done. It's making it difficult for people to do their jobs. And this is, again, something I experienced. So one of my tasks in one of my jobs that I had to do is I had to compile a monthly report in Microsoft Word from 16 different federal agencies. So not federal agencies, but offices. So there was my team. So inputs from within my program, which had like 10 different teams. And then the commerce folks had given me their inputs. Other parts of DOD. DOD is massive. So other parts within DOD, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would have to give me stuff. Other advisory and assistants would have to give me stuff. State Department would have to give me stuff. Maybe USAID, I don't even remember. But you had all these different people that would have to give me stuff. So my job, and this was all on a classified network, so I couldn't listen to music or do anything. I literally had to sit in a windowless room with the worst lighting, the type of lighting that would give you headaches. I couldn't, you can't pull up chat or Google Chat or anything. Like I was on Zipper, so I had to do the work. And it was so boring. So I had to receive these inputs one by one from each person within their Word document, and then I had to manually copy and paste all of their edits. So if you've ever used Google Docs, right, and now even I think Microsoft has this where Teams and stuff where you can track changes from multiple different people remotely within a doc. We weren't doing that, right? So I had to manually collate all of this stuff together, and then obviously have it ready for the monthly presentation. Well, my ability to do my job was incumbent on everyone else sending me their inputs. And if they didn't, I would have to, follow up with them and harass them to send them to me. So if you want to resist, that's an example of a way you could resist. Just like, don't send your inputs. Make someone else's job harder. Don't appropriate, money for something. Or, you've probably seen this too. People talking about changing language, which this is why language is really important. You can't just, if the president is saying and the government is saying explicitly no DEI, and then you change and soften the language to make it not seem like DEI, so you can still do DEI, like that's an example of resistance. So you're creating red tape. You're not showing up. And there are people who still do this. They're not working a full 8-hour day. Your tax dollars are paying for people to go sip margaritas at happy hour and do whatever and have meetings, right? You have a meeting with someone so you can go get coffee, right? This happens all the time. So they're on federal time doing all this stuff and they're not producing anything. So it just basically they're stretching out the work, moving slowly, not doing their jobs, becoming impediments. And so the idea here is if enough people within the deep state, the bureaucracy, do this, nothing will get done. Well, this obviously is going to backfire, right? Because Congress hasn't been doing their job for decades. That's why the office of the president has been doing a lot of things, especially with executive orders. So the bureaucracy up until, Trump was empowered to act on their own and they would do so. And a lot of people took pride in it. I'm not saying everyone is a bad person, everyone's a bad employee. A lot of them, there is a high degree of professionalism, but there are also bad apples. And now that there's an ideological conflict between who's running the White House and who's in the bureaucracy, it's pitting people against one another. So you have those people in the bureaucracy, right? And so what's going to happen is if they're not doing their jobs anymore and Congress isn't doing their job, well, stuff still needs to get done, right? Because everyone voted for Trump to get stuff done. So who's going to make it possible to get the stuff done? The office of the president. And so it's almost like a self-reinforcing, authoritarian, self-fulfilling prophecy here. Like, I don't think that Trump set out to become an authoritarian, but I think the office of the presidency could become more authoritarian as this resistance goes on because it's literally the only way to get things done. So instead of governing through legislation or governing through decree to the bureaucracy, it's going to look like governing by decree at the presidential level. And because of who's in office right now, there is this perception that he is usurping power and doing things against the Constitution. And even so, we can't even come to an agreement on the Constitution itself, which is a problem. So you have people in here who are like, where was it? I swore to defend the Constitution of the United States. Okay, well, what interpretation of the Constitution? Because my interpretation of the 14th Amendment right now is very different than your interpretation. So what are we even defending here? And this is why I think this is becoming so problematic, is we're living in different worlds based on different expectations of what our roles are, what our relationship with the government is. And folks within Washington, I highly recommend watching the first Hunger Games movie. When you watch the Capitol and the Hunger Games, it really is Washington, D.C. I really do think it was kind of pegged off that. People in Washington see themselves as above you. So when Hillary Clinton said that Trump supporters were a basket of deplorables, she meant it. And then obviously, this is one level of the deep state. This is the bureaucratic level of the deep state. This is how things get done, things get implemented. As you climb up, there's probably different elements of the deep state. I'm sure, lobbyists and backroom deals on Capitol Hill, Senate staffers doing, shady things. There's all sorts of stuff, right? There's all sorts of stuff that happen, House of Cards kind of stuff. So there's different levels of the deep state, but I do think it exists because I was effectively part of it. I was doing the bureaucratic stuff, and it was, the low level paper pushing, but I had power to say yes to things, say no to things, or at least my team and I had power to say yes to things, say no to things, to appropriate things, to not to. If, for example, if I didn't like the guy running my my program, right? So you had my team that dealt with the Middle East. You had a team that worked in Eastern Europe, and one that worked in Asia. So you had different teams, right? If I didn't like the guy, the GS15, who is the guy that ran my team, if I didn't like him, I was like, hey, like you're a terrible dude. I don't want you to get promoted. It's within my ability to work as slowly as possible and not get things put onto contract. So then he has all this money at the end of the fiscal year and he looks bad in front of his boss, right? So there's all these different like petty office politic things you can do depending on your motivation. But I think people who are motivated against Trump for ideological reasons, I think they are working to oppose him. And then, of course, once these people are let go, so this is why the Supreme Court case here is interesting and important to pay attention to, because I don't think these people are employable. I really don't, especially if you have a bullshit degree, like a master's of public whatever. Like I went to a university that offered an MPA, Master of Public Administration program, and I befriended a lot of people in that program, and I honestly had no idea. I was 21 at the time. I didn't know what an MPA was. I didn't know what any of it did. But if you're someone who has like a bullshit degree like that, a master's degree, and you're in a ton of debt, and you live in DC, maybe at this point in your career or in your life, the golden handcuffs have come on, so maybe you have a couple kids, a spouse, a house, and you need your job, these people are going to be further incensed because they feel like they're entitled to their jobs. They feel like almost like an absolute monarch, like it's their God-given authority to rule the rest of us because of their, self-credentialed elitism. And of course, they're in an echo chamber with people who validate their Delulu beliefs. So they think they're in the right when, again, they've never been to America. They live in DC. They might be from America, but they've never experienced America. Like they have no idea what's going on in the rest of the country, because they're seeing, they're living here with all these people and they're seeing the world through the lens of the New York Times, MSNBC, and NPR. And so they think Trump is taking over the country. They legitimately think this. And so these people, now their jobs are at stake. They're not going to get private sector jobs. There's no way they're going to get private sector jobs. Again, I'm speaking from experience here. Like I said before, one of my tasks was to manually collate a document from different government agencies, right? That's not a skill. That's not a skill. I can't put that on a resume. I can write out some bullshit fluff about it, but that's not a skill. So I said this to the program manager when I left my last job in DC. I'm like, look, DoD can't keep managing programs by PowerPoint, because that's effectively what DoD does. Is everything is run through PowerPoint, and the rest of the world has moved on to tools like Trello and Asana, and now because of AI, you can add AI agents into the mix to like manage programs, make sure you're on time, on schedule, under budget, whatever. Like you can do all that now. You don't need a bunch of PMPs to tell you how to do that. And so these people, they're obsolete. They're obsolete. They have the only value bureaucrats have, and you see this with the FDA and Big Pharma, is that the people on the inside who know how to pass things and approve things are the ones who can be bought up by Big Pharma and Big Food and all these, the big things, and brought in to their fold and give them, a pipeline into the process. And that's why they do that. That's why Big Pharma, takes up FDA folks when they leave, because they know they understand the game, and so you want them on your team to get your pharmaceuticals passed. And so the only value these people have is their knowledge and understanding and potentially social capital within government agencies to get around the regulations. That's the only value these people have. They have no actual skills or special knowledge
I mean, some within Intel, sure, but you know, a lot of these people, humanitarian workers, like, what special knowledge do you have that you can capitalize on, right? They have nothing. They have nothing to offer the private sector. Maybe nonprofits. Maybe these people can go to nonprofits. I don't think they'll want to work for that level of a pittance, though. So I don't think they're going to. But they have nothing to offer. And so now these people, if they weren't pissed off enough that the orange man is in the White House, I think the loss of their jobs is going to make them even more angry, because now it's existential. Now their livelihoods are at stake. Now they're no longer preferential special people with elite status and the ability to use their status to do good in the world. So it's become existential for them, and it's concerning. Like, what are these people going to do? What are these, you know, we're already seeing escalations of leftist violence, of people taking action into their own hands to do things. And so I'm not saying any of these ladies here in this picture are going to do anything, but it just takes one pissed off, angry person who has lost their job in the federal government, who believes themselves to be a bureaucratic god, essentially, to take action. And I think that's very concerning. So the deep state does exist. It is real. I think there's different levels to it. I don't think it's as, you know, conspiratorial as people think it is. There are people like this who think they're better than the rest of us, and think they're entitled to legislating and ruling on our behalf because we're incompetent to be able to. If you're interested, I've written a couple pieces about this. So this one is about how we're run by a bureaucracy, and it gets into kind of what a bureaucracy is and why I think we're run by one, and why governing without consent is a fundamental problem to democracy. The other one I wrote is about my experience being a bureaucrat, kind of talking about what I talked about just now, and why I think Doge was a good thing. I regret that the fallout happened between Trump and Elon Musk. I was rooting for Doge because I do think there's way too many regulations, and the more regulations you have on the books, the more bureaucrats you need to manage those regulations. And if they're in charge with regulating, they're empowered. They have power over people's lives, and I don't think that's a good thing. So if you want to check those out, feel free to do so. You can also follow and subscribe to Tomorrow Today, right, about all sorts of different stuff that might be of interest to you. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. That will help me immensely as I grow this channel. And let me know what you think. It helps me figure out, you know, what types of things to rant about. All right, I'll see you in the next video.